When Constantine won the Civil War after the Tetrarchy and converted to Christianity, he began an ambitious building campaign throughout his empire. And this was a symbolic act, as we've seen with so many Roman emperors and leaders in general. This rebuilding campaign was, like others, intended to proclaim his presence, but also intended to give something back to the Roman people who were now his subjects. And what Constantine did was to mount major buildings on important Christian sites, such as here, the tomb of St. Peter in Rome. He also built a church over the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem, another one over the site of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And these churches that Constantine built established the norm for church architecture, at least in Western Europe, for the next, really, forever, up until this very day. So what we're looking at the left is a reconstruction of the church over the grave of St. Peter in Rome. We have to look at a reconstruction of this church because it was torn down in the early 16th century by a pope who had decided that it simply wasn't big enough anymore. So what we have only are the archaeological remains and the reconstruction that we can talk about. It's an important building because, like I said, it does set the stage for Christian buildings in Western Europe pretty much for all time. The layout is based entirely on the old Roman basilica. Under Constantine, this now becomes the norm for Christian churches. Remember that in the basilica, we're looking at the Basilica of Constantine here. You entered through the side, there was the statue of the emperor there for public proceedings, but the basilica was like a multifunction civic building, a municipal building. It was not a church or a temple or anything like that, but this is what is now translated into the church for the Christians. Why did they use this instead of a temple? Well, there's a couple of really good reasons. One is they didn't want their churches to look like pagan temples, so they didn't want to use the Roman temple type. But furthermore, the basilica was where you went to be in the presence of the emperor, and a church is where you went to be in the presence of Christ. And so it made a good analogy that way. Furthermore, for Constantine, using the basilica was a strong symbol that Christianity, the religion, is now closely associated with the emperor, because basilicas were indeed built by emperors. This one is as well. It's just a basilica to be used as a temple. Now, in adapting the basilica to their uses, the early Christian architects made some changes. Remember that Roman basilicas are often entered from the side. You make a turn to see the statue of the emperor, and the aisles on the sides are for various other uses. And for a Christian basilica, this has been changed. The entryway is from one end, and it's meant entirely to focus you on the apse at the far end, which is where the altar is. In this case, it marks the grave of St. Peter, which is directly beneath it in the crypt. So they move the entryway from the side to the end. This makes it far more theatrical. We're looking here at a 16th century fresco that recreates the original interior of St. Peter. In addition to reorienting the church by putting the entry at one end, we also have some additions. Well, first we work our way through the central nave. This is the Latin word for boat. You can imagine this as being our ship to salvation. And it leads us to the transept at the far end, which is higher and better lit. Transepts are not in every single early Christian church. In fact, they're somewhat of a rarity early on. So even though this might look like a Christian cross, it is mostly by chance at this point. The reason there's a transept here at the grave of St. Peter's is to accommodate the great number of pilgrims who are making their way to this site and were visiting the church outside of the Mass. So this is something to house the great number of visitors here, the transept. And it's easy to remember as a term because it transects the nave. Also indicative of its use as a church for the pilgrims coming to St. Peter's is the number of aisles on the sides. You'll notice in both of these that they are lower than the nave. They're darker than the nave as well. And in this case, we have two sets of aisles on either side rather than just one. And again, that's indicative of the great number of people that were coming to St. Peter's, just as they are to this very day. Certainly the height was meant to show the hierarchy of the church. In most churches, the central nave was reserved for the local parishioners who had gone through the initiation process for Christianity, whereas the aisles were reserved for visitors and for people who were learning about Christianity but had not yet entered the faith. According to early Christian custom, those people could hear the Mass but not witness it, not watch it. And so they would hang curtains between the columns that would allow them to see the interior, but not actually see the priest performing the Mass. So the height of the church in the center is meant to show the hierarchy, I think, in many ways, of the Christians who occupied that space, versus the novitiates, the up-and-coming Christians that are relegated to the aisles. Here's a surviving early Christian church. Normally they're flat-roofed. Normally they have columns on the side, sometimes with a flat entablature, sometimes with an arcade, as we see here. But the decorations inside are almost always above that arcade inside the nave, and high enough that they can actually be seen from the aisles. Imagine again if you had curtains strung between the columns here, you would still have a view up to the mosaic decorations on the side. Here we see a detail of one of these mosaic decorations. This is the preferred medium of early Christian church decorations. Is in fact in mosaics. What a mosaic is, and I think we talked about this in class, is a series of individual glazed tiles called tesserae, glazed in different colors and then set into wet plaster. Some of them have gold and silver foil behind them. Others are simply glazed with colored glass. So the basilica is one kind of early Christian building that we see quite often. It's the standard type for early Christian churches and churches in the West throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. There was another type of building in the early Christian world that was round, like you see with Santa Costanza here on the left. These were mausoleums. They were burial sites. And this is in fact the burial site for Constantine's daughter, Costanza, who was later canonized, sainted. The idea of a round church, which we see clearly here with the aisle going around the outside. This round form was adopted from Roman mausoleums, which were also round. And this means that even though we enter from one end and there is a slight recess at the distant end, there really is no apse, there's no real nave. The aisles become what's called an ambulatory because you ambulate, you walk around the outside of it. And these were for viewing this burial site, and the sarcophagus would be placed directly in the center. What we'll find in Western Europe is that while temples, churches, tend to be basilica forms, mausoleums tend to be round or centrally planned. For example, here in Ravenna, we see another central planned mausoleum. We talked about this briefly in class as well. You can see that this one is square with 4 equal length arms. But again, this is the central planned church, which is the norm for early Christian mausoleums. This was built in particular by the daughter of a Roman emperor. That's who Galla Placidia is, the daughter of the emperor. And the burial site was going to be, one of the arms is the entryway, but the other 2 arms were going to be burial sites for her and her brother and her father, the emperor. And you'll notice, if we look at the mosaics, that over the doorway we have the Good Shepherd. This is very common for burial sites, especially in the early Christian world, this idea of faithfulness, even in the afterlife. But here you'll notice that he's clothed as an emperor. Again, the symbol of Galla Placidia, the daughter of the Roman emperor. Well, that's it for our brief review of different kinds of early Christian religious buildings, both the basilica used for churches as well as the central planned buildings used for mausoleums.